Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Pratt. I am the Peacemonger. Today is Friday, the 20th of February. I'm delighted to welcome today Captain RN retired David Fields. Now, David's a good friend of mine. We served together in Moscow at the British Embassy. He was still there when I arrived in the summer of 2014. He was the UK Naval Attache, hence he's captain of the Royal Navy. But he was actually posted to Russia on two separate occasions and is a Russian linguist, probably speaks better Russian, frankly, than I do, but has had a range of operational tours as well, including commanding HMS Westminster and doing 1 year on the Royal Yacht Britannia, which I'd love to talk about today, but there probably won't be enough time. Um, but he also actually last year he retired not that long ago, but long enough ago that he was able to kind of write a book about British military, or more specifically, a UK naval collaboration with the Russian Navy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's the Royal and Russian Navies. I've got a copy of it there. David hasn't signed my copy yet, which I'm a bit annoyed about, but won't get
Next
bogged down
time.
in that. Welcome to the show, David.
Ian, thanks very much for having me. Very good to see you. It's been a while,
It's
but
been a
I know we
while.
keep in touch. Yeah,
It's been a while. I mean, like, it was last April, I think, that we went to the book launch
yeah.
for this, and with Robert Avery, the co-author who sadly passed away last year
Mhm.
suddenly. But he was a terrific Russian linguist as well. He was in the Defense School of Languages. I understand, a real expert on
Yeah,
on Russia there. And at the bedrock of this book, I think it is partly one of the threads is the need to can understand Russia better,
yeah.
both from my in the diplomatic service circles, but in the military circles. Do you think we've kind of we have lost that ability to understand Russia, today from the HMG kind of military diplomatic side of things?
Well, yes. Frankly, in a one-word answer, yes. I think we have. I think one of the mistakes that we made in March 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea was, amongst all the other measures that we took in order to show our displeasure with what Russia had done, was that we cut off all military to military dialogue and cooperation. Now, the cooperation bit I get and I understand, ship visits and exercises together in that type of atmosphere, not great. But to cut off all dialogue, I think, was a mistake because it did not leverage the relationships that actually we had built up over the preceding 25 years or so since the end of the Cold War. And that cooperation and military dialogue had actually become quite deep, not just within the Navy. The other armed forces were also involved, the Army and the Air Force, and we had arms control implementation groups called JSIG, etc. But the Naval Cooperation Program really was quite deep and quite unique. And by 2014, we'd had something like 56 ship visits between the two countries, numerous flag officer visits as well. And we'd also had the Royal Yacht Britannia, actually, having mentioned Britannia, go into St. Petersburg in 1994 with the Queen embarked and Duke of Edinburgh. Yeltsin came on board. And Flag Officer Royal Yachts, who was in charge of the Royal Yacht at the time, had a small lunch party on Britannia. And we have a picture in the book which shows a rather grey, dour little man standing on the front of the ship with all the other guests. And it was Putin, who came along during his time as deputy governor. So we have built up quite a strong relationship with the Navy. And I think one of the mistakes we then made was to cut that dialogue off and not leverage those relationships which we had built up over that preceding 25 years or so. Now, I'm not saying that that would have changed the course of history if we kept dialogue going, but we shall never know. And, we just removed the fora and the mechanisms with which we could have some dialogue with the Russian military behind closed doors, at least, in the same way that we did during the Cold War. And so we've got ourselves into a position now, certainly on the military to military level, where we've had no meaningful conversations between respective militaries, apart from very high-level phone calls between Chief of Defence Staff and his opposite number, Valery Gerasimov, but nothing else for now nigh on 12 years. And then last year, or 2 years ago, sorry, in May 2024, UK took the unilateral decision, and I understand why they did it, to remove to expel Russia's defence attaché. They retaliated and kicked our sole defence attaché from Moscow in May 2024. And so for the first time since 1941, we have no military representative in either capital, which strikes me as not right. So, if you're not in the same room as your adversary, it's very difficult to begin to get some sort of understanding, which doesn't mean agreeing.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, people think that diplomacy is about just talking to your friends.
Yeah.
The most important diplomacy is talking to those people with whom you have differences of opinion, quite significant in the case of Russia.
Yeah.
Sometimes almost unbridgeable differences of opinion, but nevertheless, you have to kind of talk about them to avoid killing each other. What I like about the book, the favorite bits of the book that I really enjoyed were the personal stories. There's the Royal Marine officer who speaks a bit of Russian, and he disembarks at Kaliningrad, I think it is.
Yes, that's right, Charlie Wilson. Yeah.
Yeah, and he has to go and be the liaison guy, and some Russian opposite number takes him under his wing, takes him home, and basically, looks after him, and they build a relationship. I mean, that for me resonated because it was exactly sort of my impression of what Russians were like when you so have a bit of an effort to kind of get to know them. What was your experience like of being a quite a senior British naval officer in Russia in terms of engaging with your contacts? I mean, how did you find them? Did you find them impossible to deal with? Did you find them actually, despite the differences of view on many issues of policy, how did you find them to actually work with?
Well, I think if you go back to when this all started, as it were, which was the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Soviet Union a couple of years or so later, I'd been brought up, having joined the Navy in 1981, thinking the Soviets were, and the Russians, Russians, were out to get us, annihilate us, and send us into piles of radioactive nuclear dust. But actually, and I can remember I was on the Russian language course at the time with Robert teaching me, and also now Vice Admiral Simon Lister. And I can remember the morning after the Berlin Wall came down, we went into the classroom with this sort of, my goodness me, what does this mean for us? We might actually get to speak Russian. We might actually get to meet Russians. We might have ship visits and the like. And we thought, no, there won't be ship visits. Just sort of, that won't happen for years. And yet, within 6 months, we had a Soviet destroyer coming into Portsmouth in July 1990. And that sort of kicked off the start of there have been other talks going on behind the scenes for the preceding couple of years, staff talks and things, but that kind of started the dialogue off. So, and then when we met them for the very first time, having had this image of them being 10 feet tall, baby-eating monsters, it kind of didn't feel like that. And what we actually discovered was great warmth of hospitality, great sense of humor, great respect for the Royal Navy, that they referred to us not as enemies, but as adversaries, that the common enemy was the sea, the hostile environment of operating the sea, which was actually a unifying bond, brotherhood of the sea, with us. But there are always these sort of darker forces behind the scenes when you're having these interactions with these people who are more pro dialogue and pro cooperation. But nevertheless, it was a different culture to the one I'd anticipated meeting. And so during the 90s, that as we bring out in the book, that really was the peak towards the end of the 90s of the sort of dialogue and cooperation between the two navies. Not that it didn't go on, but Putin came to power, other things happened. The relationship generally between Russia and US started on a sort of downward decline, until 2014. So we chart that in sort of three chapters, the 90s being a good cooperation period, the 2000s being a bit difficult, things aren't going quite so well politically. There's headwinds when Litvinenko gets murdered, Russia invades Georgia, all these things start to impact. And then we try and reset the relationship, or Obama does in late 2000s, and Cameron tries to do the same in 2010. There's a little bit of a blip up in that period, but actually 2014 we obviously plunge off the edge. So we found naval people who were willing to engage, certainly at a personal level, who were intrigued by meeting us, who also had some sort of almost naivety about, why does the West hate Russia so much? Why does everyone hate us so much? So we used to have long discussions about that. And the warmth of hospitality, the vodka, the banyas, all that sort of stuff, which is where business quite often got done, whether it was organizing ship visits or whatever it might be. But I was always very conscious of the less supportive elements, shall we say, of the Russian system for any sort of deeper cooperation or collaboration with the Navy, or between the two militaries. That was always sort of in the background a bit. But by 1998, we had signed a naval cooperation program memorandum of understanding, which was the first time that had ever been done, and so it was an exciting time.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same about the UK system, though. For all those people that, I think, in my experience, fairly small number of people are pro engagement, that there's a larger number of people in the background who think it's a terrible idea.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, that's very true.
I mean, I had a friend in the presidential administration, and if I was thinking of some idea, I'd sense check it with her, because she'd actually talk about the crazies in the Russian system that might want to derail it if I didn't kind of try and land it properly, with the system. So yeah.
But you're right. What we tried to do in the book was to intersperse the sort of factual discussions and analysis of what happened and what went on with these personal anecdotes. So you've picked up on Charlie's, which we kept in verbatim because we thought it was so good to show an example of what the Russians can be like. But we've also got senior officer anecdotes in there as well, like Vice Admiral Tim Clement and Admiral Charles Stile. Again, they provide context for some of the broader points we make in the book about Russian culture and the way they behave and the way they think, through people's first-hand accounts. I've got one in there as well from my time in a Russian warship for about a week, 10 days during an exercise as well, which was an experience.
Yeah, I remember you talking about the heads. And,
yeah. It was an experience, shall we say.
And there's the anecdote, which was the anecdote about the guy who got an admiral's uniform or an admiral's jacket that's now in Gosport Submarine Museum.
Well, it's not there yet. So Robert, we've touched on a sore issue there, but no, not sore issue. Robert was a hoarder and a collector, and he has a huge amount of stuff which we're, deciding what to do with at the moment, whether to auction some or put some in a museum, etc. Well, one of the things he had was Admiral Gorshkov, the famous Soviet admiral who built up the Soviet Navy into an absolutely huge force. And he managed to procure in Moscow one of his uniforms. And so he has got a uniform in his flat. And but Robert used to make us dress up in it in order to get into the mood of doing interpreting exercises and Russian lessons like that. So, yeah, it was quite amusing.
Incredible. Yeah. Incredible. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that completed, but even when I was in Moscow, I mean, 2014, the Ukraine crisis started. We still had Princess Anne come out in, I think, 2016 for the Arctic convoys, or maybe it's 2015. Yeah. I think it's 2016. Yeah.
Yeah,
She went up to Arkhangelsk, and I mean, the Russians made a big deal of it, a really big deal of it. I mean, it's really important to them, this kind of shared history. You go to
yeah,
kind of Victory Park, it's outside the center of the city, and you've got that statue of the Allied servicemen. I mean,
yeah.
it's still really, really important. So
It
even
is.
today,
I mean,
I think.
yeah. It was really after 2014 the one remaining thread of connectivity connection we have, but even that I think is now pretty thin / almost broken.
Hmm.
Um, but the shared history played a really important part in cementing and establishing the relationship. We all know that Peter the Great came to study shipbuilding and in Deptford back in the day in order to sort of help them understand how to build navies, etc. So there was a great historical link going back to 1696. And then Catherine the Great, she had an admiral called Admiral Samuel Greig, who was a Scot, and he commanded Catherine the Great's Imperial Navy. And in fact, over 50% at one time of British of officers in the Imperial Navy were British. So there's very strong historical links, which the Russians, don't forget actually. And when we signed that memorandum of understanding, we used that history to our advantage, because the person who signed it, Admiral Jock Slater, his wife, Lady Slater, was the 4 times great granddaughter of Admiral Samuel Greig, the Scottish commander who commanded Catherine the Great's Imperial Navy. When we dropped this into the conversation the night before the MOU was signed, and we had the head of the Russian Navy there as well, you could hear a pin drop. They were completely bowled over. And the following day, Lady Slater's program was changed completely, and she came into the main naval staff as a guest of honor to be shown the portrait of her ancestor. And then the Arctic convoys as well, was a really strong thread throughout that whole 25-year period of veteran events, the annual celebration of the first convoy, which was Operation Dervish as well, inevitably, more often than not, with a ship going up to Murmansk, Arkhangelsk as well, Severomorsk and Arkhangelsk as well, in order to take part. So the Arctic convoys were a big deal. So history is a big thing. And yeah, definitely helped, cement the relationship. But I just wanted to go back to one other point about the sort of the 2014 period. And as I was saying before, this is to do with sort of Russian bewilderment, if you like, about the West and why don't we like them so much. This sort of touches on that. But and I've put this little story in the book for no other reason, just to sort of highlight this point. I had an interlocutor in the Western Military District in St. Petersburg called Konstantin Gurniev, and he was responsible for our bilateral program between the two navies. And actually, in 2014, we were going to do 2 things. One was we were going to sign a military technical cooperation agreement between the UK and Russia, which was to be signed by defense and foreign ministers. And the second thing was that we were actually pursuing quite an ambitious bilateral program based on the fact of these resets in the relationship, which I spoke about politically. So we had ship visits lined up, Royal Marine bands, we had exchanges of students between colleges, this sort of thing. And of course, come the annexation of Crimea, we cut all that off. And I was asked to go up and see Konstantin to sort of pass his news. When we got there and we had a cup of coffee, he sat down with all his papers for the program and started going through it. And I said, no, Konstantin, stop. He said, why? I said, it's off. It's finished. Done. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, Crimea, bit naughty. And he went, no. He said, Crimea's always been Russia. And politics, politics, leave them to it. We know what we're doing. So he said, let's go back to the ship's program. So the ship's going to come from Helsinki into St. Petersburg on May the 16th, whatever. I said, no, Konstantin. I said, it's off, finished. He says, I don't understand. He said, why would you do that? I said, because the annexation of Crimea has not gone down well. You can understand. And 18 months later, we had another conversation, and he was thoroughly depressed about the whole thing. So
Yeah,
there we go.
the Russians really value form, and the form of these events are really, really important to them. I think, and I think we often kind of miss that fact. They really kind of value the symbolism of things like this, and see. Of course, it isn't a bump in the road. We've got full-scale war in Ukraine now, but I mean, geopolitical events as bumps in the road. Longer term, they want to kind of be friends. I mean, that's always the impression that I got. But I mean, how can we get back to just the basics of dialogue with Russia at a military to military level, beyond the very, very, very occasional CDS call to Gerasimov?
Well, this is one of the areas, obviously, that we tackle in the book, as well as looking at the history of what we did and what we achieved. We have a chapter of what we understood and what we learned about each other, what the Russian Navy is trying to procure and the type of Navy it's trying to procure and what for. And then how do you engage with that Navy? Now, engagement, of course, takes let's call it interaction for now, because actually engagement and interaction with the Russian Navy at the moment is across those three words that I've mentioned: confrontation, competition, and then cooperation. Of course, at the moment, and rightly so, we're in confrontation / excessive competition, defending and deterring, whether it be against our critical national infrastructure or what they're doing in Ukraine or whatever. And that's absolutely right. But of course, there's always going to be a time where a conflict comes to an end, and then you've got to start thinking about how do we re-engage? How do we establish some form of dialogue? How do we establish some forum in which we can have conversations, difficult conversations? And it is going to be difficult. I've made the comparison in the book about, we have done this before. We've come out of a Cold War period of confrontation. But for me, this is on a different scale, because we have been actively supporting Ukraine and supplying them with weapons which kill lots of Russians and help Ukraine defend themselves. Absolutely right. We've indicted people for war crimes, senior generals, etc. We know that Moscow views London through a pretty bad lens in terms of what they think of us. So finding some grounds to re-engage in some sort of dialogue, I think this time around is going to be really challenging. And of course, you can't go it alone. You've got to do it in concert with allies, or there's got to be some sort of common front, as it were. I mean, the last time that we did this was through a little bit of using retired personnel, whether it's senior officials, senior officers, in what we call sort of track 2 dialogue, which makes it a bit easier, where you can start having those difficult conversations, and then you can sort of move on from there. But the trust and the mutual trust and confidence between the two sides has been shattered by all of this, and therefore I think it's going to be a really difficult process. But you've got to kind of start somewhere. And track 2 dialogue between think tanks like RUSI and its opposite number REAC, for example, over in Moscow, or senior officers who pre-2014 are now retired, but they had a good relationship with their predecessors, also in the Russian system. That might be a way to do it. But I don't underestimate the challenge. And of course, politically, the politicians want to be very, very careful about how this is sold to the public. Here we are saying we must be prepared for war. We're going to go to war with Russia in 4 or 5 years' time. And on the other hand, we could have a peace deal in a few months' time. Who knows? And a scenario where actually we're having to actually talk to the Russians, which is suddenly going to be really quite politically awkward. I mean, you'll know this far better than me.
Yeah, but I think most members of the public are sort of open-minded about things. Actually, I think the challenge politically for the government is to explain how we said Ukraine would win all along, and they didn't. Quite frankly, and that's one of the reasons which I think is keeping the war going, because it's going to be an awful. Any settlement for Ukraine is going to be worse than it would have been had they taken something in April 2022. I see no other way around that. And even though
Yeah.
Russia's suffering economic headwinds, I think Putin will have taken NATO expansion off the chessboard, and I think that for him, if he only gets that, that will be a massive strategic victory that he can sell to his people at the end of the war. And politicians in the West will have difficulty explaining away Mark Rutte, Keir Starmer, and the rest of them. I think there's going to be no easy way to kind of spin failure. I think, and that's the kind of mess we're in now, that nobody has a way out of that, a credible kind of pathway out of that. I mean, that's certainly how I see it anyway. And I think, but in any case, I mean, but going back to your book, I mean, I think the striking thing is how when peace does happen, I personally think the war could go on until next year. Frankly, the way things are going, the way the Europeans are kind of trying to block any peace deal with these preconditions, which are quite bizarre. But the position will be reversed from that which was in place in 1991, when we had our Royal Navy rocking up into Kaliningrad with all of dilapidated facilities, rusting ships, and to a Russian Navy when peace in Ukraine breaks out, whenever that may be, which is much, much, much bigger than ours and more modern. So, psychologically, the relationship will be different. They will see us as the bit part players, the kind of reduced power. I mean, I think. What do you think? You know the Russians pretty well.
Well, I think one of the lessons one of the points we make in the book is about what lessons each side learned about each other. And one of the key lessons they learned about us was how we were reducing naval capability hand over fist over that period and getting rid of platforms. That didn't go unnoticed. In fact, there was a defense analyst, I think a couple of years ago, who wrote an article in Nezavismaya Gazeta, which basically charted the decline of the once great hegemon of the world's oceans, and charted the decline of the Royal Navy to what it is become in terms of platform numbers. And strangely, they were rather sad about it. And my interlocutors in Russia were rather sad and bewildered by it as well. And the Russian Navy, took the lion's share of the modernization program of the Russian armed forces, which started in 2010. And although it has struggled to build sort of frigate-sized vessels and above, who doesn't, and programs have been delayed, they have been able to produce, somewhere in the region of 13 nuclear-powered submarines, diesel-electric submarines, a number of corvettes, size vessels, all of which are, possess land attack cruise missiles. And those hold adversaries at risk quite effectively without being a great big seagoing navy. They still obviously do go to sea. They do have an offensive role within their strategy. So although their navy has definitely risen from the ashes of post-Cold War, it was in a hell of a state, and lots of us saw what that state was. They are in a much better place to fulfill their objectives than they were, 10 or 15 years ago. And we must remember, of course, that although there have been some notable losses and setbacks in the Black Sea during the conflict, actually the bulk of the Russian Navy has not been committed to this conflict at all and has continued to grow. And even in the Black Sea, where there have been losses, it's still been able to function. We had politicians saying to us a couple of years ago that because of the Moskva sinking and Russia having to rebase its assets and, adjust its operating patterns, that it was functionally defeated. Think For me, there was just another example of wishful thinking that, Russia's going to collapse, it's going to be driven out of Ukraine, it's going to economically collapse. Its navy is rubbish and its military is rubbish as well. Not that there aren't problems, we know that. Economically, there are, there's stresses and strains, of course, and there's going to be big balance of investment decisions that will need to be made after this conflict for their armed forces generally, and the Navy will be subject to that. But right now, if you look at their policy objectives for their Navy, they're kind of fulfilling them pretty well.
Yeah. Is that, by the way, is that Moskva on the front of your book?
Yeah. No, that was the Marshal Ustinov. It was a sister ship.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Okay. It's a very similar configuration.
No, we had a I went on board Marshal Ustinov during that visit. We had a huge lunch, lots of naval attaches and heads of navies there, and all the rest of it.
Lots of vodka.
And Admiral Gromov, I think it was, stood up to make a toast, and he went on and on about the premier navy in the world and the aristocrats of the sea, and etc., etc. And everyone was waiting, hanging on every word to see what he would say. And he finally said, to the aristocrats of the sea, the Royal Navy.
Yeah, very good.
And all the other navies were.
Yeah.
So, just an example of the sort of the esteem that they did hold us in. So they were very surprised at the reduction in capability and platforms. And Admiral Yevmenov, who's commanded the Russian Navy during the conflict, he moved on now. He was deputy commander in the Northern Fleet, and he and I met for about 2 hours in 2013. And he was absolutely bewildered that we removed our maritime patrol aircraft from service in the 2010 review. He said, why did you do that? I said, well, And he said, but you're the premier maritime nation, and you haven't got your own maritime patrol aircraft. I said, no, but we're part of NATO and allies, and we share assets. He said, yeah, but you haven't got your own maritime patrol aircraft in the UK. And then he rocked back and he said, I suppose it makes my life easier.
Very Russian.
And I went, oh, okay. And off we went and had some vodka, and we talked about salmon fishing and together, and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, but it was mutual professional.
Yeah, and the Russians love to mix it up, don't they? They want to talk business, they want to talk family, they want to talk fishing, and they will talk whatever. Let's have a drink of vodka, and I mean that's, and I think we struggle to do that because we only want to talk business. We're very, I don't know if it's in the Anglo-Saxon sensibility, but the Americans are the same, possibly even more extreme than us. I mean, they go into a meeting, they have their line to take, they want to kind of push that forward. And the Russians like to kind of get to know, they like the preamble, they like to kind of find out about your family and that sort of stuff. I think we just don't understand how to negotiate with the Russians and how to engage with them. I think we really, really struggle with it. And instead we kind of force-fed these kind of sound bites. And you mentioned like the economy. I mean, all the time Russia's economy is about to collapse. Oh my God, it really isn't. Our economy is doing far worse. Putin's going to die at any moment. I mean, just like non-stop. It's just like quite incredible. But there you have it. Hopefully we'll kind of eventually navigate our way out of it. Well, why are we struggling to kind of? I mean, we've sent carrier strike group up to Arctic apparently. The last time we deployed it had 3 surface ships. We don't have any solid supply kind of capabilities. We're getting Spain to build that for us. I mean, why do we struggle to build ships in this maritime nation? I mean, why is it so difficult? I mean, what is wrong in the MOD? They've kicked back the defence investment plan again. We don't know when that's going to be published. They haven't published an equipment plan since 2022. And you mentioned 1696 and Peter the Great in Deptford. I mean, this is about the Army, not the Navy, by the way, but the MOD released figures say that our Army there's only been 3 recorded years since 1650 when our Army was as small as it is today. It's just like 1822 and 1823 are 2 of them. And then there's only 1,000 troops different, but the population was 4 times more. I mean, how have we ended up? I mean, we seem to spend all our money on these massive procurement projects that don't deliver anything. How have we got to this state? I really, really don't understand.
Ian, nor do I. is the blunt truth.
Good
I
answer.
have not been in the capability procurement area. I don't know the ins and outs. I don't know why it's been so difficult. It strikes me that we have cut to a certain point where actually now it's really difficult to regenerate some sort of mass. I know that we're, our strength lies in the fact that we're part of NATO, and therefore, and all the assets and all the capability that brings and that we can contribute. So, yeah, could we go it alone against the Russian Navy? No. Could we go alone against the Russian Navy with part of NATO? Yes. And so now we're getting into the so there's allies, and then there's the hybrid navy concept, the crewed and uncrewed platforms. But again, which is great, but again, uncrewed platforms do not give you mass for certain tasks, and the command and control of them and where they're going to be and how they're going to operate, etc., is really challenging. And of course, one of the things that has happened as a result of this war is the turbocharging in the Russian military as well as the Ukrainian of uncrewed vehicles, vessels, etc. And they are churning them out 19 to the dozen, innovating, learning. And again, I can see a situation where their ability to produce these things will far outstrip ours. But, there are ships in the pipeline. There are the Type 26s, the Type 31s, but the delivery schedules are incredibly slow. And by the middle of the 2030s, I think it is, when they're all supposed to be in service, and I doubt they will be, we'll still be, in terms of frigate destroyer force, not much bigger than we were, if at all, than we were in 2010.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I mean, Keir Starmer in his Munich conference speech spoke about, us having 10 different, I think it's 10 different main battle tanks in the different NATO armies, 20 different types of frigates, or maybe it's the other way around. And yet we have two separate frigate programs, two separate destroyer programs, and two separate attack submarine programs. We've got the Astute, which we haven't finished building yet, and we've already started on the AUKUS. We haven't built the last of the Astute class subs, and we're already starting on the AUKUS sub program. For example, the Type 26 is all late. Glasgow is still not operationally kind of up and running, although may well be soon. Type 31s. Type 45s spend most of their time in dry dock, and we're building the Type 83s. It's just like, oh my God, do we just have one frigate and one destroyer and just keep things simple? Yeah. I know nothing about, I'm a diplomat, I'm a non-naval person, but whatever. But no, crazy.
I think it would be safe to say it's not an ideal situation. I have to be a little bit careful because the guy I mentioned earlier who'd learned Russian with me, Vice Admiral Sir Simon Lister, he's in charge of building the Type 26s. He's BAE ships in shipbuilding. So if ever he were to watch this, I need to be careful. But, these guys are working incredibly hard to deliver the capability. Financial constraints, manpower constraints to build them, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's a systemic problem. Right down to the skills of our within our industrial base. Not that we have much of an industrial base. Everything, our education system, everything. I mean, when you see a ship turning up several years after it was meant to turn up, I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Really, it's the whole kind of system, and it's the same with diplomacy. I mean, I mean, we're just not training diplomats anymore. Hardly any people speak Russian or Mandarin or Arabic. It's a systemic problem. That we face, and actually our inability to engage with the Russians, the Chinese, people in the Middle East. It's just reflective of that. The system itself needs pretty deep-seated reform. At least it seems to me. But anyway, no, that's really interesting.
We shouldn't. The Russian shipbuilding industry has equally the same problems. It's been inefficient, cumbersome, not delivered on time. As I said, they struggle to build these frigates and above for all sorts of reasons: skill fade, money, corruption, all those sorts of things. So I wouldn't want people to go away thinking, bloody hell, the Russian Navy is so much better at building these things. They have the same constraints and the same frustrations as we do. Um, um,
But they're
on
still
the sub,
pumping out the platforms, and we're not.
well, they're still pumping. They're certainly pumping out the submarines, but then they've always been good at pumping out submarines. Surface ships have always been you
Yeah,
know, the purpose of the Russian Navy and Gorshkov's vision for it, and I don't think much has changed in this respect, is that the submarines are the most important element of the Russian Navy, and the surface fleet and naval aviation are there to protect them. So they've got a lot of skills and capability subsurface. They've always been better underwater, frankly, than they have been above water,
yeah.
which is a problem for us.
Oh yeah. But my favorite quote from the book was quantity has a quality all of its own.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
it doesn't matter if some of the kit isn't as maybe as
yeah,
flashy and high tech
yeah,
as ours. They just have a
yeah.
hell of a lot more of it than we do. But there you go. I mean, that was really fascinating, Dave. Thanks so much for taking the time. It's nice to talk to somebody who's a genuine expert who actually understands what it's like, the difficulties and challenges, but also opportunities, of course, of working with Russia, and how somehow, when this war ends, we'll need to kind of get back to some sort of path of re-engagement, with the Russians against what I suspect will be a lot of political resistance in Whitehall to do so.
Yeah, it will be. It will be.
Yeah.
And of course, looping right back to the start of the conversation, how do we, about the understanding Russia bit, is that, of course, if you say we need to understand Russia better to a politician or to many other people, that instantly means that you agree with them in some shape or form.
Yeah, exactly.
That you agree with the invasion, that you're an apologist for Putin, or an apologist for what they've done. But that's not what understanding your adversary means. You need to understand how they operate, how they think, and how they behave so that you can make better policy.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you'll just go on making the same policies and making the same policy mistakes.
yeah,
And have those robust conversations once you've got a better understanding of each other. I mean, you could argue the Russians didn't really understand the Ukrainians that well because they thought they would just fold and collapse, and were
yeah,
surprised by the ability with the way they defended themselves,
yeah.
and that other people would come to their defense so readily. So it's a two-way street, this understanding thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think because 2014 was relatively straightforward in terms of Crimea, they probably
Yeah,
vastly underestimated the scale of the challenge. I mean, it's certainly the kind of battle around Hostomel right at the start.
yeah,
What I mean, that the Ukrainians held on to that in the way that they did will actually change the tide in terms of that first, 72 hours of the conflict, it seems to me,
yeah,
when the Russians quickly stalled and realized that actually, they couldn't get rid of Zelensky in the way they'd hoped, and they didn't have the capability to kind of basically launch some sort of assault on Kiev itself. So yeah, I mean,
mm,
big game changing
mm,
moment. But yeah, I know it's. I mean, I say time and time again, diplomacy isn't about friendship. I mean, it's a bonus if you can have it. It is,
right,
and
yeah,
sometimes you can be friends with your adversaries, but still be adversaries, right? And that's something that
yeah,
Russians can teach us. But I mean, it's about coexistence and finding a way to,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
engage
and
so that
that
we're not
that and
killing each other.
that's the, yeah, and that's very much the note I end on in the conclusion, is about how do you find coexistence.
Yeah,
Because even in the good days of cooperation, the 90s and early 2000s, we were still doing a little bit of competing, confronting in certain areas, or defending and deterring.
yeah,
We the cooperation wasn't necessarily an equal. I mean, it was. You know, it's like a barometer today. We were doing more cooperation and less competing and confrontation, and then the
yeah.
dials change depending on the political circumstances. So we were still coexisting. We were still doing all three things, just maybe different levels. I think
I
that's
mean,
called
you
coexistence.
never get to a perfect state where you just completely friendly, even with your allies. I think, even
No,
with your allies, even with the Americans, as we've
yeah,
seen over. Well, I don't want to get into that, but over
no, no,
Starmer's
no, you mean,
decision
yeah,
on so on. But the
yeah,
Chagos Islands and Fairford. But yeah, no, exactly. I mean, you never. I mean, Gordievsky was sold out by the Americans, like a spy in the CIA, working for the KGB, because they've been spying on us to find out how we're getting all this pretty good Soviet intelligence. And so yeah, I mean, even with your best friends, you never,
No.
complete friends. But there we go, life
Yeah.
lessons
Yeah, we
according to
coexist
two
with
old fogies.
exactly. And we coexist with China, don't we? So we managed to do that.
Yeah, and yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and I think actually it's one of the areas where I think Starmer is probably right, and I don't agree with them
Yeah.
on all things, quite frankly. But in terms of just recognizing that China exists and we got to get along, with them, and actually we're losing massively economically, sort of by just cutting off links completely with them. So yeah, I mean, I think that completely makes sense. But I think the same is true of Russia in terms of the self-defeating, but buying expensive American gas instead of cheap Russian pipe gas. I mean, just like a shot in the foot. But there we go. Don't get me onto that. But thank you so much, David. That was really, really
Thanks, Ian.
good. Thank you, everybody,
Thank
for
you.
watching the show. Please like and subscribe if you found that as thought-provoking. It's nice to have somebody who genuinely understands Russia, has lived there for many years, knows the people, but also understands the huge complexity of just working together. And this was, pre kind of war, obviously. So we've been really lucky to have David here. So thank you all for watching. Thank you again, David,
Thanks,
for
Ian.
joining, and wishing
See you
everybody very
soon.
much peace. See you soon.